After Hylics came and went, it left some people yearning for more, since the game was rather unique and showed quite a bit of promise if there would be any further games, or hell, just really any new game from Mason Lindroth. So, this is where we talk about Muldulamulon! Yeah, that's right, we're not done with his side games just yet, but it won't be long, and it does offer some context, but I will be putting a timestamp so you can skip straight to Hylics 2, however. So this was made for Ludum Dare 40 in 2017, and is a Metroidvania this time around. This largely does everything you'd expect a Metroidvania to do, where it's a fairly open level that's just sectioned off by various obstacles, with the first obstacle you face being that you have a disappointingly realistic jump height. It doesn't really feel great, but you get the improved jump almost immediately. Once you have that, you can reach the next power, which is the sword that offers you a projectile attack. This is where you might notice a quirk this game has. Every time you get a new power, the world changes with new enemies and sometimes obstacles. I find this to be really weird because Metroidvanias generally reward you for familiarizing yourself with a given area, but by adding new obstacles, you end up needing to relearn the area anyways since you might not immediately recognize it. Also, the way you get out of here is really weird. You have to get over this spike, but you can't jump over it normally, and it's an instant kill. Well, it turns out the solution is that you're required to take a hit in order to stand on this enemy, which apparently counts as a flat surface. I had to look at his walkthrough because I never would have guessed this. He made everything red for a reason. It kind of indicates that these are things you should avoid. After that, you get a bomb, which allows you to explore much more of the world by just blowing through it. From here, you could even get a few potions to boost your max HP. One quirk with this bomb is that the explosion lingers for a while, so if you run into the particles even after it went off, you can still die. Then you get your last power shortly after that, which is a magic carpet. This is primarily used for the obstacle course section, where you have to navigate around spikes and enemies, which, it's not very fun to be honest. The problem is controlling this thing is a nightmare because you aren't locked in place while you ride it. The carpet always moves forwards, so you change directions by tapping left or right, which moves you around on the carpet itself. So correcting yourself sometimes can be a huge pain as you try not to walk off the carpet and die, especially in this one really narrow area. But once you finish that, you just fight a simple boss by spamming your swords, and you're done. All wraps up at around 10-15 minutes. Overall, it's a huge improvement over his previous Ludum Dare games. It's more complex and more of a game in general, with easier to follow levels than what we've seen previously. Probably the biggest benefit is that you can actually play this game right now on itch.io, unlike all of the other games in Part 1, which is nice because ever since Part 1, I've been completely unable to get Maxima to work. So, cut to a year later in 2018, and Mason drops a preview video showcasing Hylics 2, and man, this video astounded me when I first saw it. I actually hadn't even heard of Hylics up until now. It was this preview that got me to try the first game because I just needed more of this art as soon as I could get it. Then you should have seen the look on my face when I beat Hylics across 2 days, and would come to realize I'd be waiting about 2.5 more years for 2 to come out. And man, that wait sucked. I actually ended up watching the preview trailer and the second trailer once every few months just because the art was incredible and the game just showed so much promise. These trailers are actually very interesting when I look back at them. While they are there to advertise the game, they also serve as a look into a very different version of Hylics 2 than what we got. Like, very different. They were all still RPGs in the end, but the structure and maybe even the story seems to have gone through some pretty drastic changes. The most notable difference is that the world itself. In trailer 1 and 2, we get glimpses of the overworld, which is laid out in an entirely different way to their release version, with some areas just not being present, like Somsnosa's house or this weird miniature city. Trailer 1 even shows enemies actually roaming around said overworld, which is something that also doesn't happen in this game. It could have just been done to test enemy behaviors on existing maps if it was early enough, but that's just purely speculation. Another big change is that you see an entire gameplay element just get removed from the game. In a few shots, you see what looks like a top-down shooter section of the game, which is noticeably absent from the final release. My guess is that it probably just didn't fit very well in Hylics 2. The last change I want to highlight is the playable characters. All the characters were redesigned slightly, and in Wayne, Dedesmal, and Somsnosa's case, they changed what outfit or hat they were wearing. But most interestingly, Pongorma went through 2 different redesigns. In the first trailer, he had a face where his more memorable horns were represented by a hat he wore. This version kinda reminds me of Greek statues. And in the next trailer, while we see the final design for everyone, Pongorma, interestingly, has a completely different look. He has kind of more an outlaw feel to his look, with his face angled down, hat obscuring him slightly, and the points of his hat trying to form the horns that he previously had. Which makes me wonder all the more about how they came up with the final design for Pongorma. It seems at some point, he just threw up his hands and said, "Ah, fuck it, he's a Death Knight, so let's just give him a knight's helmet, but weird." Which I love. His design stands out so much more than the others than if he was just another soft-faced character with a hat. And it makes all the more sense when you remember that he's from an entirely different age, as he was sealed in a vault and waited out multiple apocalyptic events. I really enjoyed looking back at these trailers from the perspective of having played through the game 3 times, because I got to see this game evolve over the course of these 3 trailers in a really cool way. But enough of what this game could have been. Hylics 2 is, as an understatement if anything, a massive improvement over the first. Gone are the RPG Maker days of flat 2D planes and awful resolution, 3-frame walk cycles, and enemies that consist of action figures with clay heads. Easily the first thing you'll notice is the improvement in art quality. He must have been so proud of it that he made the title screen include a few enemy idols as well as spelling out the name of the game with his hands. It's crazy how much effort has been put into this game's art. Claymation isn't easy, especially with how smooth these animations are, and I'm more curious what he did with the terrain. It can't all be clay, right? Creating unique walls, buildings, and fields for every single area out of clay just sounds like a monumental effort for one guy. Whether or not it is all done with clay, it still looks phenomenal all the same. This game also includes a few cutscenes here and there. Upon starting up, you get this scene of a pod opening up, releasing a yellow orb that expands into a creature that kind of resembles Wayne. That is all you get for this intro, and I love it already. You would eventually come to find out that Wayne isn't just a person. Wayne is a species, and these things are the Wayne larvae, which are the creatures that the Waynes grow up into. And yes, you can pet the Waynes. So after that intro, we're put into the first area, which again is a solid explanation of everything you really need to know. I love how the gag of putting the game's revival item in the first toilet is also present in this game, as it's not even the warm burrito this time around, it's the soul sponge. You're also introduced to a few new mechanics. First is rolling, which allows you to dodge an enemy encounter if you choose to not engage at that time. I personally really like this because fights can take some time, and some of the areas in this game are much longer than they previously were, with more complex tasks that needed to be done. The amount of fights in some areas can kill the pace a little. The next mechanic is the slap. This can be used as either a combat approach or your heal outside of combat. If you were to slap an enemy, it initiates combat and your whole party gets a bonus to your max will for a few turns. This is really nice since will is something that's used so much in this game, so getting a free use is pretty great. As I mentioned, this is also used to heal after combat. Bathtubs are much less common in this game, with only 2 in the entire game. Instead, you heal by slapping these white bugs that you come across in the world. They are everywhere and often in groups of 3 or more, with each one healing 15% of your max health and will. They also respawn after every fight you get in. Unfortunately, as a result, they completely remove the ability to use gestures and items outside of combat. I can see why, but some areas can be a fair walk back to the nearest set of bugs, and they might not even fully heal you, as well as some enemy encounters just being too close to one another. The only problem I really have with the starting area is that they don't explain the bug slapping part. You might figure it out on your own that you can slap bugs, but it doesn't easily convey that you're getting healed from it since you won't even see combat for a while. At the very least, it is explained in the first town. Once you leave though, you'll enter the overworld once again, with your destination set to New Muldul. You can go to a second location if you want, but unlike the first game, you're very much not meant to go there at all. While in the first game, the enemies in the control center were fairly doable with just Wayne since they didn't blind you constantly, these guys are just too high of a level for you. Plus, there's nothing you can really do here until much later in the game. So, off to New Muldul. This place is probably going to keep you busy for a while because there's quite a bit to explore here and there's a lot of verticality utilized, which is where one of the issues I have with this game comes up. While it's cool the game offers you 3D spaces to mess around with, sometimes walking and platforming on the terrain can be a bit messy. Yes, there is platforming in this game. It's light and mostly utilized for secrets, but nonetheless it's not great, largely because the perspective really messes with where you feel like you are. They even added a landing indicator post-launch because it kinda was that bad without it. Probably the only strategy I'll directly mention in this video is to buy a juice from the merchant here to take to this guy in the mines of New Muldul. The reason being, he gives you a key to a room that provides you one of the most headache-saving gestures in the game, Soul Crisper. This is the only gesture outside of a character-specific gesture that sets enemies on fire, and it's very important for you to use for one reason: the Pool Man. These enemies are so annoying because they can infinitely split into more and more pool men, making them a pain to deal with. Thankfully, you can at least whittle them down to 0 eventually because the copies take the same HP as the user. But that was only post-launch. On launch, each copy had full HP, meaning fights could go on forever. Setting them on fire also stops this and makes them so much more manageable. Also, apparently Wayne's Disillusion spell specifically does more damage to those guys, and I don't think that's ever mentioned. I only ever saw it brought up in the Steam forums when Mason was replying to people complaining about the Pool Man. And I swear, Mason knew there would be such a memorably awful enemy that it's one of the only enemies that gets a leveled version. The vast majority of enemies stay the same across the entire game, so if you see an early game enemy in the late game, they'll die pretty quickly. But the Pool Man get a new type called Pool Mange, which is even worse because not only do they split into Pool Mange as well, but whenever a Pool Mange is hit by anything, they trigger an attack that applies a damage over time status which doesn't go away unless it's cured. This means in order to stop them from multiplying, you have to take a hit no matter what. And that is just so evil, and I kinda love the absolute gall to do that. The consolation is that Poolmen drop Poolman Wine, which is a surprisingly solid item. It boosts attack for a turn or two, with the downside of having a side effect to go along with it. And getting Soul Crisper makes you encounter pretty much the only enemy you'll find before getting 2 other party members, which is a nice contrast to the first game where you encounter an entire area full of enemies before even getting your first party member, so it's just so much more manageable in the early game. With that out of the way, you can proceed to the castle to speak with their king, only to find out he's been taken by a ruler named Viewfax. In his castle, you'll find Pongorma as your first party member, who gives you an ability called New Metaphor. This is just a levitation power that lets you travel at high speeds and across gaps to access many places you couldn't previously. So now you can make your way to Viewfax's castle, where you meet up with Xeno pretty quickly here, with this marking the first time you can actually get into regular combat. But I gotta say, I love the new designs for these characters. Pongorma being this weird fuzz-covered knight is such a cool idea, and Deduzbald rocking this suit of armor with his saber is just anime cool. Though it's kind of funny he has this, since there are no weapons in Hylics 2. Every damage boosting item is just some variation of a glove, since all you do is gesture at people to damage them. Combat is also a little bit different in this game. The biggest difference being speed is now a stat and isn't solely reliant on what gesture you used. But on top of that, status effects now have a 100% chance of activating. Unless an enemy can specifically block a status, which few can, every status effect can hit every enemy, and this applies to you as well. This is important as nearly every ability in the game revolves around a status effect or getting rid of one. It makes the combat a lot more interesting as you're not just picking the best attack, but instead working your way around all the status effects that can go off. Guarding is also a status effect that lasts until you get hit, so it lets you use defending more in advance rather than having to anticipate being hit that turn. It also makes the first skill you get really good since it's a heal that also applies guard to whoever you heal. And speaking of gestures, you might have also noticed something. Look, both Deduzmol and Pongorma have the 2 gestures you found earlier. Finally, the game now provides the previously found gestures to everyone you meet. I haven't seen if meat boosting your max HP does this too, but it really doesn't matter since you almost immediately get Somsnosa as well, and you're not really likely to find a paper cup when Somsnosa is available. I also found myself really enjoying the intrinsic skills each character had more because they're just way more unique and useful this time around. Wayne gets a gesture that deals damage over time and lowers enemy attack. Deduzmon gets a great heal that also blocks 2 damage over time status effects, while also increasing your max HP. Somsnosa gets the only real multi-enemy gesture in the game, and Pongorma gets a gesture that hits an enemy for almost double damage, but comes at the cost of stunning himself for 1 turn. And something I never went over for Hylics 1 that also applies to 2, but the sound effects in this game are really amazing for these abilities. Pongorma's lightning especially is just so satisfying to use. The The last major change to combat is that the enemies are just more interesting now. Some have gimmicks like special quirks to them that make them stand out more. Some will rage on the first time they're hit, some perform special guards that reflect massive damage, they might multiply, and so on. There's just a lot more going on that makes the combat that much more engaging. So, once you scale the castle, you reach the first boss of Viewfax, which gives you a taste of how bosses will usually end up. They tend to be fights that go by quickly on both ends. 4 people targeting one enemy who has roughly 4 to 6 times the HP of the surrounding enemies means that fights won't last too long in the grand scheme of things. But the boss also has some pretty nasty attacks so that they can take you out pretty quickly in turn. I like this approach so you don't end up banging your head against the wall over and over again for long periods of time each time you do fail. With him down and the king freed, one thing becomes more apparent. This game is surprisingly normal? Like, the inhabitants are still these weird and hard to distinguish humanoid mounds of clay, and the enemies are even weirder monstrosities, but this game follows a much more sensical approach to its nonsense. Everyone talks in proper sentences, which can give you directions, flavor, or even a story. A warm burrito is no longer the revival item, for no reason. It's now the soul sponge, which in a way could make sense in this world compared to a warm burrito. Really, the weirdest that this world gets is that some of the language the NPCs use is just words I've never heard of before. Like, did you know the past tense for smite is smote? I didn't. I kinda like that I know that now. So that's actually something I kinda miss with the first Hylics. The absolute nonsense and crude designs made the world feel very confusing to try and follow, and was kind of disconcerting in places. Even a simple face like Wayne's was off-putting with the upside-down mouth and eyes it had. But in Hylics 2, everything is softer, like the facial expressions on Somsnosa and Wayne. Everything kind of makes sense in its weird way, so while the world is amazing to experience, it's much more relaxing than it is uncomfortable. The music being a significant improvement doesn't help with that, as much of an oxymoron as that sounds. Also, I kind of miss how every ability had a unique phrase when it's used. In Hylics 1, you had user extruded a dark spiral, or user manifested a blade of hollow pleather. In Hylics 2, everything is just does. Wayne does disillusion. Dedesmon does foam armor. I do like how it uses the word deploy for items though. Wayne deploys cupcakes, a phrase I never knew I wanted. But moving on from there, we now have our airship given to us by the king after he tells us about Gibby's resurrection. And at this point, we can go anywhere and explore. But unlike the first game, there is a required path. In order to get to the next boss, you need to find a key which requires you to take out this shield by playing a side game. It takes you to a 2D platforming section where you play as a little Wayne armed with a projectile attack, dash, and double jump, and you just gotta get to the end. It's strikingly similar to Muldulamulon in its art as it's straight up taken from that game in places, and some of the mechanics like the flying carpet make a return with just as much annoying jank as ever. It also seems Mason realized how silly it was to make an enemy with contact damage be a platform, because he made that exact enemy have an actual platform glued onto them instead of just having a random floating platform move side to side. It was weird when I first played this game, but after seeing Muldulamulon, it's kind of funny now. And, okay. I can't go on any further without talking about the soundtrack to this game. I wanted to wait up until this point specifically because the music in these platforming sections is insanely good. At some point, seemingly late into the development of Hylics, Mason hired a composer to work on the game. You can even hear the stark difference in Mason's soundtracks in the first 2 trailers, with the final soundtrack done by Chuck Salamone. If you ask me, Chuck is the biggest reason Hylics 2 feels so different. The distorted and all over the place style of the original Hylics soundtrack further emphasizes the surreal tone of the game, but the music provided by Chuck is incredibly relaxing. The fights in this game feel so much different to other games because every other game tries to make all their fights sound intense and action-packed. But Hylics 2's music, on the other hand, it's like it's walking up to you with a cup of hot chocolate and a blanket, just spending some time with you before you fall asleep. It's great, and I will make you listen to it now. Also, I want to give a slight shout out to Chuck himself, as he is just intoxicatingly passionate. When Hylics 2 came out, you could see him on every last video people posted, especially ones that had to do with music. I don't even know a lot of what he talks about, but I still find myself really enjoying his streams with Mason about the game. If I were to complain about anything in these sections, it would probably be the length. If you're intending to explore every last corner, since there are items you can find, then these can go on for a while. I enjoy them, but they kinda go on too long for how strong the platforming is. He is getting better at making platforming, but there's still a little bit jank here and there. So once you beat that, you can enter the Worm Cave, which kinda suffers the same fate as the platforming sections. It can go on a bit too long, as walking through here is a bit of a maze and you don't truly know where the path to get all the items is, since many items don't even appear unless you find the right path. But as far as the art, it's a really nice set piece. So with the worm taken out, you can move on to the next and personally my most hated area in this game. It's a huge desert that requires you to hit a few switches in order to progress. The switches can be found by following the wires. Seems simple, but honestly it's a lot more convoluted than that because many of the wires will just suddenly go all the way up to a ledge. Then you just have to figure out how to get to that ledge, which honestly just took me way too much time. Once you complete this area, you enter a fight with the wizard trying to bring Gibby back and are met with failure when you do defeat him, as the ritual can't be stopped by this point. So you're immediately thrust into combat with Gibby, who instantly kills you with dynamite. Utilizing his massive power, he manifests a tower known as the Hylics Xylem, which he uses to suck out the terrestrial juices from the afterlife in order to try and reshape the world into some kind of new chaotic state. In doing so, the tower emits waves which begin to transform virtually every NPC in the game into a white incomprehensible mass. This is where my favorite detail in the game comes in. Remember when I said this game had no randomly generated dialogue? I lied. It does, but only after Gibby transforms everyone. The dialogue isn't done on the fly like in 1, but it does change when you reload the game. I just love how it ties the chaotic surrealism from the first game in with the more normally structured world of 2, in that it was all Gibby's fault in the first place why those worlds were just so different from each other. So from here you can actually beat the game. There's nothing really stopping you except your stats, which aren't really that far behind either. If you choose to play the rest of the content, you will get access to the Supreme Gesture. To do that, you have to visit the King's Vault and take this bomb to this excavation site, which you had access to in the beginning of the game, but you're just too low level. When you get into the ruins, you're faced with another perspective and gameplay change. This time, we're in first person and can move along a grid. This place does have enemies in it, but the primary focus is just trying to navigate your way through this place. The central puzzle being these few blocks in the center that you have to move around in order to get access to different layers and different sections of the area. And unfortunately, like the previous few areas, I found that trying to get everything just took so much time. And because the majority of the environment looks pretty samey, I found myself getting confused a lot. It doesn't help that this area has a lot of Wolfenstein 3D type secrets, where you're just trying to rub your face against a wall to make it work. Between this area and the desert, I felt like a third of my first 13-hour playthrough was just figuring out how to beat these two areas while finding everything. This time around, I ended up not bothering with exploring these areas much and ended up beating the game in about 7.5 hours while also kind of barely remembering where I was supposed to go in the first place. So there's two important things you need to find here. The first is a sage that can be accessed on the upper level who gives you a token that functions like it does in 1, and he also informs you about the locations of the other two sages. But a quick side note, one thing I love about this sage is if you walk up to his hands and legs and hit the use button, you can just steal them. You'll get pretty shitty items for it, but you could just steal his hands and legs. But the next and just as important step is to activate a switch that can be found on a different floor after a boss fight. And this is where you can not only use the sage tokens for a super powerful gesture, but you can also buy some nice items off of them. The gesture this time around is called Bombogenesis, which is a pretty fucking amazing name. They actually tried to make this a bit more balanced this time around, even if it's still hilariously overpowered, but not as bad as the Legend of Melting was against the final boss. What they did is, not only does it require you to spend one turn charging yourself first, or else it'll do 5 damage and then hurt your party, but it also consumes your entire party's will and has its damage boosted based off of that. So if you have a full party at max will, you can just about squeak out enough damage to one-shot almost every enemy in the final area at once. But against the final boss, it's not as good since you have to keep building your will on the spot, which sucks if you don't have multi-juices. That, and it's better to just use your gestures instead of using all of your will on Bombogenesis. Pangorma's charged lightning strike does comparable single target damage, and he doesn't even need to drain everyone's will to do it. So with that, you're not ready for the final area. In here you're faced with various pools of fluid that require you to drain them in order to proceed. In doing so, you also uncover a lot of extra items for you to stock up with. Pretty nice final area. Thankfully it doesn't last long, and with Bombogenesis, you can easily end encounters if you just don't feel like trying anymore. So now you approach the final boss, Gibby, soaking in his bath of terrestrial juices that he siphoned from the afterlife in order to increase his power. What follows is kind of a cool moment where your party has a conversation with him, not about any heroic speeches of saving the world, but reasoning with one another about their cause. Gibby wishes to see the world in its former chaotic glory, back before some event called the Accretion put an end to the era of the Sages. Wayne argues for maintaining the order of the world. Dedusmoln argues his efforts to destroy and reforge the world will rob us of the opportunity to uncover the history that laid before the Accretion. And the last with Pangorma, Gibby specifically pleads with him as he was even around before the Accretion and was familiar with the so-called majesty of the era of the Sages. But while Pangorma recognizes this, he himself has grown a liking to this world and refuses. I really enjoyed this because there's not a whole lot of animosity towards either party. They're just doing what feels right. And then out of nowhere, oh yeah, you thought I was done gushing over Chuck's music, but you were wrong! This is Fancy Meat Computer, the final boss track. It is fucking amazing. It's easily one of my favorite boss tracks ever. The fight itself is also pretty fun too, and shows the kind of power Gibby has. Every few turns, he'll summon an enemy to help him, up to a pretty big amount if you aren't keeping them in check. With the phrase, Gibby reflexively summons minions, as if he's so powerful that his body is acting in his defense unconsciously, paired with the fact that the body is just menacingly walking towards you with these contorting hand movements also adds to the charm of this boss. Also, nice feat, Mason. But admittedly, not the hardest boss either. So after taking him out and the Hylics Xylem explodes, you're dropped into a void which puts you on a stage and lets you mess around with some musical instruments as a returning gag from Hylics 1. If you play this enough time, it'll even spawn NPCs who have some unique things to say. The ending sequence after that is incredibly trippy and I love it. Mason must have decided that his games were close enough to a playable prog rock album that he just made the ending into a surreal music video. And just in case you thought we'd go an entire Mason Lindroth game without dancing, he pulls through for us. So welcome to Hylics 2, motherfuckers! This game, much like the first, was such a trip from beginning to end, with some incredible production values. Admittedly, in a few places, I felt it dragged on too much, and could still use some tweaks, but overall it was a very solid RPG regardless of whether you're playing it for the art or not. But that's not the end of Hylics 2, as there was one thing that came out of nowhere about a year after Hylics 2 came out. Chuck got together with Mason to make an album based off Hylics 2, effectively giving every character their own theme songs that all widely vary in how they sound. It's called Moonage Lobotomy, and it's great. I'll leave you to listen to my favorite of the mix, Bolt Thrower, and thank you for sticking around.